Welcome to Intersections, where faith, ideas, and life meet. Today we're talking about children and pet grief. Leigh, earlier we were talking about our first experiences related to grief and pets, and you talked about two stories. You talked about the story of a duck and a story of Rat-a-tat.
You know, I think I was about 3 at the time, a long way back down memory lane, and we lived in a very remote part of New Guinea on a leper station. And the local people brought in a couple of little ducks, wrapped up, because they usually eat them, but they figured they'd get some more money by selling them to us. So we're looking forward to these pets, because pets were scarce. So we wrapped these ducks up in a little box to keep them warm. Next morning we checked on them, and they were cold.
Aww.
Carla was about 3, and my brother, who was about 6, started crying. And I'm thinking, grief? Crying? You're supposed to do that when something's cold?
Huh.
First impressions of death.
3 years old.
Yeah. And I imagine a lot of our viewers can identify with that. Now, my little boys had a little rat, pet rat. Now, we struggled with getting a pet that was kind of a good pet to have, that was hardy and whatnot. And believe it or not, pet rats are great. Some people don't like their tails, but the rest of them is good. Well, he was named Rat-a-tat. And Rat-a-tat dropped dead one day. He died. And my 4-year-old boy was devastated. It's kind of like, what am I supposed to do with that? So what we did was we went and had a funeral service. So I figured, it's important to kind of do services to put things in context. And out of that came a yard marker. My little boy carved up a piece of wood, and somehow we wrote Rat-a-tat on the wood, put it in the backyard, and to this day, there's a marker saying Rat-a-tat.
Oh, so this is a marker you have in your backyard.
Yes, it was important.
Children, when they lose a pet, it can be a very difficult experience. And
Yes,
today we've invited a specialist to join us to talk to us about children and grief, especially the grief that's related to loss of a pet. I'd like to introduce Dorothy Clark Brooks. She's a child life specialist. Many hospitals have child life specialists that specialize in children and grief. And she's here to talk to us about how children cope. Dorothy, early when we were talking, you told me the story of going to your grandmother's funeral. Can you tell us that story again?
Yes. I was about 10 years old, and we received word that my grandmother, my mother's mother, had died. And she lived in another state, so we needed to travel to go and be there for the funeral. And we had a pet cat, and we needed someone to care for that cat. So we found some friends who determined that they would be okay having the cat remain with them while we were gone. And we went to the funeral, and I remember at the funeral that I was mostly very sad for my mother. I thought that the pain that she was having was so intense, and I was wishing there was a way that I could take that away from her. And when I returned home, we found something that happened.
Well, and Leigh, we have a
Yes.
picture of the funeral here.
Captured here on this little photo that kind of hides its age, right? I mean, kind of a photo. This is when you were how old?
About 10 years old, and that was right after the funeral with
Right.
part of our family there.
Okay.
So you all gathered at the funeral, and you're saying you felt for your mother, who
I
was
felt for my
sad.
mother.
But when
Yes.
you came back home, something else.
Well, when we returned, I looked forward to seeing my cat. My cat was named Muffin. And what happened is the cat got loose from where they were keeping her. And I think she was trying to find her way home. But we never found the cat. And the grief that I experienced when I got home was much, much more intense than the grief for my grandmother.
You're remembering it now. And that's not uncommon. When we lose animals, it can really impact
Yeah.
our feelings.
Oh, it's so true. And I remember that I didn't talk about it because it was a cat, it was an animal. And when an animal dies, that's different than a human. And nobody told me that it wasn't okay to talk about it, but I thought inside that that was wrong, that I would have more feelings for my cat than my grandmother. And I think that has influenced me in making decisions to help children at a time of grief, helping them in loss.
loss.
Yeah. What a story.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people can relate to that. Now, Beth Gilbert is one of my colleagues. And Beth, you have a passion for animals.
Yes, I do. And for people. For both.
Oh, okay.
I work with so many people who, in the hospital, who have lost their health, lost their family members. But there's a part of us that have animals, and when we lose our animals, who can we go to talk to? A lot of people don't understand. And just yesterday, I was talking to one of our colleagues, Jim, and he was telling me a story. I went into his office and I said, Jim, can you tell me a story about children and pets and just how their bond, you know, so strong? And he said, Beth, sit down, sit down. And he started telling me about his dog that he had ever since he was little. And the dog looked like Rin Tin Tin, and they would do everything together, and they would go swimming and sleep together. He would sleep on his chest, and I mean, just a bond that was incredible. Well, as he was telling me this story, his eyes got really watery, and he said, yeah, he said, when I was about 15, Rex, that's the dog's name, Rex ran across the street chasing a rabbit and got hit by a car, and he witnessed it. And Jim he had tears running down his face. And I said, Jim, that's so powerful. That happened 43 years ago, and you still feel that bond. And that just shows how much animals, no matter how many years it's been, we have this special bond.
Dorothy talked to us about her passion for helping children in grief. You also have a passion.
Yes. We have so many different grief recovery groups that we hold here. We have the divorce recovery. There's grief recovery for people who lose their family members. And I decided to start a grief group for people who lose their pets, a grief recovery group.
Now, that seems really unusual.
It seems funny.
You know, it does seem strange, but can you believe this? The card industry,
Yes.
Hallmark cards, for instance, have put out cards, you know, for the loss of pets. Isn't that amazing?
That is amazing.
You know, so, you know, the temptation to think, oh, it's just an animal, get over it. But people take it seriously.
Oh, yes.
So there's losses of, I mean, even the industry takes, you know, note of this. Fascinating.
A lot of people have a question about whether children who lose pets should be a part of the whole dying process, that maybe they should be protected. You know, maybe they're too small, too young to understand grief, and should be protected from the whole process. Can you address that, Dorothy? I think you have a story about Chocolate Chip. Yes.
Chocolate Chip was a guinea pig, and my son named him Chocolate Chip, although he didn't look like a chocolate chip. He had different colors, but I think it was a favorite name, and he was a dark guinea pig. But over the years, we really grew attached to the guinea pig, and we bathed this guinea pig every other day. It was a very, we had a lot of rituals with our guinea pig.
Now, do guinea pigs need bathing, Lot?
Well, this one did. We grew very attached, and even though it was a very messy guinea pig, we loved our Chocolate Chip. And we started noticing that Chocolate Chip was having some difficulties, and we decided to take Chocolate Chip to the vet because we weren't sure what was happening in her little body. And so I remember going with my son to the vet, and there were two entrances. There was the dog entrance and the cat entrance, and we were trying to figure out, we stood there for a moment trying to figure out which door we were supposed to bring the guinea pig into the veterinarian.
Was Chocolate Chip more like a dog or more like a cat?
Well, we decided maybe more like a cat. So we went in the cat entrance, and the veterinarian was very, very understanding and told us that Chocolate Chip was having a real difficult time and would not live much longer, and that Chocolate Chip might be suffering. So he said, it is time. Well, my son had probably never heard that before, it is time. So we went home and talked about what it is time meant. It meant that Chocolate Chip's life was about to end, and there was a way that we could ease that life and make it gentle a gentle passing of death for the guinea pig. So it was determined, and there was a time and a day when we would take Chocolate Chip to the veterinarian. And I was planning to take Chocolate Chip. I asked my sons if they wanted to go with me, and they said no. And I was gathering my courage to go because I've never done that before. And at the end, I needed to ask my husband, and he said, yes, I will do that. Now, we wanted to make that passing time as precious for Chocolate Chip as we could, so we gave Chocolate Chip her favorite foods at that time when we took
What
her.
was her favorite?
Her favorite foods were celery was one, and then the other is carrots. So carrots and celery were placed with her in her box, and she was just having a wonderful time eating that as we took her. That was her last supper.
Her last
That was
dinner.
her last meal. And then my husband returned probably
No,
about...
you know, we're laughing about that, but talk to us about the decision that went into making that a special time
Well,
for
I
Chocolate
think
Chip.
because we knew what she loved, and we thought this is the last gift that we can give to her. She loved eating, and when we'd open the refrigerator, she would squeak. She knew what was in the vegetable drawer. She knew the sound of that opening, and the celery and the lettuce when we would get that, and the carrots, and she knew when those were coming.
So it wasn't out of guilt. It was
No.
a gift.
It was a gift that
That's
we
beautiful.
gave to her. And when my husband returned with her, I noticed she hadn't quite finished her favorite meal. And he told us it was very peaceful. And then we decided that we would have our own little service for her in a little shoebox. And we buried her in our backyard.
What a story.
Now, you have a story that kind of works in contrast to that story.
There's another story that I heard from a student here at Loma Linda University. I teach a grief class, and we were sharing stories. And when she was young, she had a cat, and her cat ran out in the street, and she witnessed it being hit by a vehicle, and she knew that it was dead. But her family decided to whisk her away right after this happened. And when she returned, she wanted to know where her cat was, and her
So her
mom
family whisked her away to protect her, maybe?
to protect.
Yeah, see.
And so when she came back, her desire was to be with her cat. And her parents told her that they had buried the cat. So she asked, where did you bury the cat? And the father pointed to an area in the backyard. So she began to dig soon after that. And on her first time of digging, she said, I could not find the cat. So I dug deeper, and I kept digging. And at that point, she decided that maybe the cat had already turned to dust because she could not find the cat.
But she was trying.
She was trying. And years later, she said, I figured out that my father probably had thrown the cat in the trash, that there wasn't a burial for the cat. And her family would not talk about the cat after the death, even though that was her desire to know more and to treasure the memories of her cat.
You know, there are times that parents are not that sensitive to the death of animals. One of my friends had a pet chicken, and this chicken followed her everywhere. I don't think she'd allowed it too much in the house, you know how chickens are, but you know, out in the yard it followed her. One Thanksgiving they ate chicken.
Oh no.
And she found out later it had been her pet chicken, and she was devastated. You know, because this had, you know, had a personality and whatnot. And so sometimes parents are a little bit insensitive here. Sometimes a pet death is the first experience of death, you know, that children have. How can this impact future grief, do you think?
Oh, absolutely.
How?
Well, as we saw when Dorothy, when you were talking about your cat, I mean, you got teary-eyed. There's still that emotions, and I know that when children can't express fully how they feel about, you know, their pet dying, it can complicate things later on in life.
So sometimes the death of a pet. Now you mentioned the death of your grandma. That was powerful, but the death of the cat. Did the cat die after or before your grandma?
And I don't know if the cat died.
Or
It was
disappeared.
missing, but
Yeah.
for me it was a death because we
Yeah.
could not find the cat.
No.
And it was after that we found out about that when we returned home. The guilt that I had over that was very difficult, though, because I felt that I was grieving an animal over a person, and I felt there was something wrong with that.
And now as you look back on it, what do you think?
I wish that I was a very open person, but I wish that I had just expressed that and said, I feel guilty, but I'm missing my cat.
Yeah.
But I did not want to hurt my mother
Yeah.
with that.
Now, Dorothy, you're talking about how a child grieves, and children are all different ages. Do they grieve differently at different ages? Can you talk to us about that?
Well, around the age of 9 or 10, children start to understand that it is permanent. But even infants grieve. When their world is changed through grief, they know there's something different. And so they respond to the climate, to how the people around them are dealing with the loss. So even infants, even though cognitively they do not understand, they respond physically. It may be more difficult for them in sleeping and eating. The patterns change. And as children grow, of course, they start to understand the permanence. Children in our hospital setting, when they have a friend there who dies, they understand earlier because of that experience. But most children between 9 and 10 start to understand that death is permanent and it may happen to me.
Well, and even animals grieve. I know that there was a time when we had 2 dogs, and one of the dogs died, and the other dog would come to the window, to the doors, sliding glass doors, and just howl. And it would just break my heart, you know, to see my lab howl over the loss of his friend. So
Yeah, that's so
animals
true.
grieve.
I was driving down the Baja in Mexico, and there were 2 coyotes, and a coyote had been hit. It was dead on the road. Its mate was standing by
Yes.
it, howling.
Oh, yes.
You know, so it was kind of interesting how animals can experience emotion as well.
We're 2 living beings, you know, so that bond is just so strong.
I was fascinated when you mentioned that sometimes the death of a pet and dealing with that can prepare kids for the death of loved ones. Say more about that.
Well, it is an opportunity, and it's an excellent way for kids. It's like a teachable moment where something has happened. There's a loss in their family or friends or an animal, and it teaches us about life and death and the cycle of nature and how there's a beginning and then there is an end. And it's an opportunity for families to teach their children about how we celebrate and treasure the memories of those, our pets, as well as our loved ones who die that we cherish.
So how important do you think is it for parents to acknowledge that? You mentioned that somebody threw their cat into the trash, perhaps. What should they do differently?
Well, I believe that many times parents protect and take children around the grief rather than through it in an effort to do what they feel is best for their child. But what they don't understand is unless they go through that experience with their child will never have the opportunity to develop the skills they need to cope with loss.
You know, I once worked with a young woman who had a miscarriage. And as I was working with her, I asked her how she was doing, and she said, I once had a pet bird, and began to weep. And I thought, I was there to talk about the miscarriage, but she couldn't even talk about the miscarriage until she had gone back and talked about this significant experience that had not been grieved. So
Yeah, she never grieved the loss of her bird, and so how can you grieve something more important if you can't grieve the past? It's very powerful.
But it startled me because I wasn't sure what the relation was between the bird and the miscarriage. You know?
Right.
You know, there are many different ways about talking about death. You know, such as going to sleep, laying down, a variety. Can you comment a little bit about some of the common euphemisms about this and whether or not they're helpful? Is it helpful to say they went to sleep?
It's helpful for the adult sharing that.
Why do you think that's true?
Well, I think because we soften it, it's easier to say
It sounds
lost.
better. You know,
It does.
it's not like your dog's dead. It's not as harsh.
Yeah.
Well, you know, we live in a different culture today. I mean, in rural communities, on farms, animals die all the time.
Yes.
You know, people are used to it. Okay, we've got to, hopefully it's not a horse, it's a big hole you have to dig, you know. And in fact, my brother-in-law had a goat and it died, and he spent hours digging a hole big enough to bury it, you know. And so, you know, it's a little bit different today where we sanitize everything.
Yes.
You go to the vet, they give it an injection, and it dies, and that's it. But saying it went to sleep, you're not too sure about that.
Well, I know that a lot of kids that have been told, oh, you know, your cat, you know, she went to sleep and she's never going to wake up, then that little kid is terrified at
Yes.
night,
Yeah.
terrified to go to bed. Oh, I don't want to fall asleep because what happens if I never wake up? You know, it's like a child can't really put sleep with death together, you know?
So how helpful is it to spiritualize it? I'm thinking of my little boy when one of the pets died. Is Rat-a-tat going to go to heaven? Am I going to see Rat-a-tat again? What do you do with that?
I think it's difficult, probably difficult, and yet I feel when I think of heaven, I think of a reunion with all those I loved and had relationships with, and I picture my pets with me when I think about heaven.
We've talked about the difficulties of talking to children about the loss of a pet. I'd like to do a role play.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay.
Let's say I'm an 8-year-old child, and while I was away at school today, my pet, let's say I have a Labrador Retriever, was out in the road, got hit, and was killed. What I want to invite you to do is say to me the things that are not good to say, so we can kind of get the feel of it. What are the things that are not best, the ways that it's not good to break the news to a child? And I'll play the role of a child.
And at 8, you don't know, I mean, it's not, you think that your dog might come back. Death isn't a permanent thing in your mind.
Yes. Okay.
Okay. You could go first.
You know, something happened when you were gone. And
What?
Your dog, we don't know what happened to your dog.
Something happened?
Something happened, and we're not sure where your dog is right now. We don't
Well,
know.
let's go find her.
Well, we've been looking.
I'll go with you.
Well, we've done a lot of looking, and you can look, but I can't have you go beyond the yard. But the dog, somehow we think ran away, maybe.
But if she's not in the yard, why aren't we going outside the yard?
Well, we've been looking, and we can drive around the streets if you'd like to do that, to look for her.
And look, we brought you a new dog. Right here. Isn't she cute?
Well, she's so cute. So maybe she can be friends with my pet dog.
Well, maybe you could just start loving her right now and just kind of don't worry about the other dog right now. You know, just give your love
But
to
I
this
am
new dog.
worried. I am worried. What is she going to drink and eat? Who's
she'll
going to
be
feed her?
fine. Don't worry about it. She'll be fine. Somebody will pick her up and take
Who?
good care of her.
Who do you think will pick her up?
God will take care of her.
Maybe God has her.
I don't know, but
God might have her. Yeah.
Maybe we could pray for God to give her back, because I don't want God to have her. I'd like her.
yeah.
But maybe God needs her right now.
yeah.
Why would he need
God
her?
probably took her for a reason.
It's
was her
interesting,
time.
in this role play, with an 8-year-old, is it helpful to say, God took the animal? She just let
course not.
What should you do? Is it...
Well, I remember reading about a little girl who didn't want to go outside after her grandmother died, and she was frightened, and they couldn't figure out, and they finally, after questioning, found out from her that it was because she thought God would take her if she went outside.
So some of the language we use can have impacts on how the kids handle death.
Well, and I'd just like to say what happened in my own heart in this role play. When you said God took her, instantly I felt as a child I would be angry at
Like,
God.
Yes.
How dare he
Why
take
would
my
God
dog?
do that?
Right.
And I was interested that that happened right here. And when you said that I could look for her, but I had to stay in the yard, then I felt angry at you. Not to let me go find her.
It's so important to be honest and real with kids.
It's interesting. I happen to have an 8-year-old, and we dealt with that. And it took him a little while to accept that one of the animals had died. And it's like, Dad, you might want to breathe. Can we dig it up again?
Yeah.
And then he talked himself out of that. But we've got to let them go with it.
Now, what did you say when he said, wanted to dig it up?
I just said, I don't think that'd be a good idea at the moment, because the way God's made them is that they tend to decompose. And we had to talk about that. You know, so looking at pet grief. Actually, Dorothy, you have a little poem you wanted to read to us.
I do. It's written by Etta LaShawn, and I think this helps when we think about how children handle this. A child can live through anything as long as she is told the truth and is allowed to share with loved ones the natural feelings people have when they are suffering.
It's beautiful.
So it allows people to share the natural feelings with loved ones. That's important.
Very important.
We've talked a lot about different types of grief, you know, associated with pet grief. You talked about Jim, 43 years ago, still remembering it. And, you know, you kind of talked a little bit about your experience in that role play, and it kind of sounded very real, Carla. I think we all have little memories that we can conjure up. So I think what's important here is that we as parents provide positive role models. Now, there is help out there. Sometimes families are wondering what to do with this. What would you do with that? I guess we can send them to therapy, whatnot. So there's different areas. But we want to thank you so much today for tuning in and watching Intersections, where faith and ideas meet.